You're listening to Artistic Finance, show 166 bonus. On today's show, we talk with June Abernathy, a touring spotlight supervisor based in Florida. Recently, she has been touring with The Lion King and Six. She is also author of the Spotlight Operator's Handbook and the tried and true book of 101 Spotlight Excuses. We discuss saving 10%, paying yourself first, gambling in the stock market, and tax considerations while touring. This episode is with Ellen from LDI as we lead up to our live recording there on December 8th at 11 a.m. That will be with Erica D. Hayes and Amy D. Lux for an episode called Financial Independence for Creatives. As you listen to today's episode, if at any point you think, it might be fun to go to LDI and be there for the Artistic Finance recording, well, I have news that might help you. We have our very own promo code. So when you register, use the code Artistic Finance, all caps, all one word, and it gets you a free Expo Hall conference pass. Such an easy code to remember, Artistic Finance. These pre-LDI episodes are intended to be short and fun. The fun part we once again succeeded at. The short part we once again did not. That's because June was very succinctly saying so many things that we've covered on this show 100 times, and I can't help but highlight those at the end with my takeaways. Links to everything we discuss is in the show notes or at artisticfinance.com/166 bonus. Without further ado, let's get to the show.
You are listening to Artistic Finance, where we help creatives learn about the business of show business.
Welcome and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Ethan Steimel, broadcasting from Lake St. Louis, Missouri.
And I'm your co-host, Ellen Lampert-Gréaux, the conference director for LDI, calling in from the tropical island of St. Bart's.
I'm June Abernathy. I'm calling in from St. Petersburg, Florida.
Oh, how are you post-hurricane down there?
I personally, we did really well. We had a lot of branches and trees down, flooding in the yard, but it never made it into the house. We lost power and water, sewer and stuff for a couple of days, but compared to a lot of our neighbors, we skated by. So,
oh, I'm so glad to hear that. It was terrible. I have friends in Asheville, North Carolina, who can't go home. They were in Atlanta and they just can't get back there.
That's astonishing to me because here we're prepared for it. We expect it. It's, this was a much higher surge than we expected. But when you live in the mountains of North Carolina, you are not expecting a hurricane.
And not of that magnitude.
Yeah, because it's not like it's a coastal town. They're hours from the shore. They're up in the mountains. So that had to be just incomprehensible.
Right, exactly. So to get back to Artistic Finance, for any of you who don't know June, she is the author of two books, The Spotlight Operator's Handbook and the tried and true book of 101 Spotlight Excuses. She has been touring the country for many years with a variety of Broadway musicals as a front of house electrician and spotlight supervisor. And she's a graduate of Florida State University. So welcome to Artistic Finance.
Oh, well, thanks. Glad to be here.
How did you get to be a follow spot guru?
It's kind of a niche job. So when I went to college, I was a stage manager. I still am a stage manager from time to time. My day job was working as a crew member, and I eventually joined the IATSE and worked as a crew member on IATSE calls, really for spending money for my day job and to sort of stay involved in the theater and everything else. And I did more and more lighting. A front of house supervisor, spotlight supervisor on a touring show, you're running a spotlight and also calling cues for all of the other spotlight operators. And so you need someone who knows how to call cues and someone who knows how to run a spotlight. And so it's a confluence of the two things that I did well. I did that, it went well. And once you get into that world, then the designers get to know your work and want to use you on other shows. And so it's sort of a niche thing. But then again, running a spotlight 8 nights a week or 8 shows a week for, years and years, I've done it a lot more than a lot of folks. Most folks, you'll run a spot one weekend, you'll do something else. Put so many hours in that I became an accidental expert. As time went on, and there's less and less training. Schools don't tend to teach a lot of hands-on training, and when they do, they don't tend to use a lot of spotlights. Even within the IA and some of the crafts and trades, there aren't as many youngsters coming into the business, and when they do, they don't necessarily have their dad there to teach them the job, and so it's sort of hit and miss. And I found myself teaching as much as anything when I took shows, and so I wrote the book to kind of save myself the teaching time.
Am I correct in picturing you like hanging in a chair above the catwalk someplace up there?
Yeah, sometimes we're in a booth, sometimes we're up on a catwalk, sometimes built into little chairs attached to a truss somewhere.
And is it different now that there's the ground control ones?
To an extent, certainly in the concert world, there's much less climbing up to a truss and strapping into a little tail gunner chair up in the rig. It's much easier to use the remote control there. To have somebody up in the rig, again, when I started, we just climbed on it. You've got fall arrest and you've got ladders and chairs and that whole infrastructure that you have to build into your rig, and harnesses and fall arrest and people that are willing to climb and also good at pointing a spotlight, those things. When you use the ground control or any other remote system, you don't have to have a human up in the rig. You just hang your rig up and your humans can stay in the basement and do their thing. And for concert world and that kind of thing, where it tends to be very broad brush lighting, you hit them with the big spot and follow them around. It's fine. There's tends to be just a little bit of lag time between the controller and the fixture. And so really precise things, sometimes it's a little off. And also, they put a camera up by the fixture or literally mounted to the fixture a lot of times, but you can only see what that camera can see. So if your guy squirts off to the other side of the stage, you're just like, oh, okay, I have no, and you don't want to sweep around like a prison break looking for your guy. You have to count on an LD or a spot caller who can see the whole stage to say, okay, fade out. Pan yourself way left, In theater, we tend to want a little more nuance. We tend to want softer edge light. It's a little more difficult to do with the remote systems. There are some shows, even on Broadway, that use those, but they tend to be more presentational, rock concert-ish kind of shows. Human operators are still going to have a much better and more nuanced response time. But again, we're doing things where humans are operating moving lights. So you've got all the capabilities and color changes and whatnot of a moving light, but with a human driving. And that's kind of the hybrid that's sort of taken over the industry right now.
Interesting. So is a Broadway show or a concert, what's your go-to live event?
I like Broadway shows. I like musicals. I like big shows because that's where I've spent a lot of my life and I enjoy it. I like concerts and I've worked some, but my tolerance for very loud music and very rude people has gotten less and less as I get older. So it's, again, I lost a lot of my hearing in my younger years to when you're running whether you're working the concert backstage or in a follow spot or whether you're going to see one, it's loud and hearing's precious enough that I don't tend to go to a lot of the big loud shows anymore. So I tend to be more of a theater person, sometimes stand-up comedy or, a small show somewhere.
Okay. Are you good, bad, or neutral with money?
Probably neutral. I'm not bad with money, but I'm not a big expert. I will say my father, well, he had a stroke when I was like 13. He lived for many years after that, but his earning potential went way down. And so my mom was left suddenly going back to law school and sort of supporting the family. And up until that time, she'd been your sort of typical 60s, 70s housewife and hadn't really dealt with the finances much. And once the finances were her problem, she was like, oh, this will not do. And so she had to sort of educate herself on how finances work. And she decided that my teenage brother and I were also going to learn how finances work because she didn't want us to be in a position of being financially illiterate and just let your dad or your wife or your husband or whoever deal with it. So we did a lot of crash course in Mom would learn about things, how investing works, how mutual funds work, how banking in general works, how credit cards work. And so we did get a solid grounding there. And it was literally from her being thrown in the pool and going, oh, what is this? We read Money Magazine, and her favorite book is The Wealthy Barber. The basic premise of the book is that you should save 10% of everything you make. If you're making $30 a week, you should save $3 a week. If you're making $300,000, you save 10% of whatever it is you're making at that time. And what you do with that savings, whether you invest it in the real estate or mutual funds or your savings account or whatever it is its own ball of wax. And the two big concepts of that book, which I still use, are save 10% of everything you make and pay yourself first. If you wait until you see what's left over to see if you have any money to save, there will never be any. There's no such thing as left over. So you got to pay yourself off the top and then arrange your life with what's left. And those two concepts sort of guided me. I like the Wealthy Barber. I've given it to nephews and nieces. That's the basic tenet. The idea that savings is not something you do. It's not a luxury. It's a necessity. I will say I work in an IA local here in Tampa, and a lot of folks retire from up north, move to Florida, realize they still need to make a living and continue to work his hands. And so I would watch guys in their 60s, 70s out in the rain at a rock and roll show, pushing boxes. And I thought, I don't want to do that. And how do I avoid that? So I started saving for retirement early on because I didn't want to be one of those folks who was working U2 at the stadium when I'm 75 years old.
So how do you approach pricing for your work or services? Does it come through the union, or you have some flexibility, or how does that work?
For freelance work, the union actually provides a great, I belong to Actors Equity as a stage manager, and I belong to the IAA as a stagehand. One of the great things about unions in all industries is that they set a baseline salary income expectation. They set a going rate or something you can use as a going rate. Because I know what the IA rates are and because I know what the equity rates are, it's easier for me than it is for a lot of people to know what the going rate is. You know, are you underpricing yourself or overpricing yourself as a stage manager? Well, I can look at what the equity rate would be for a comparable job and get a ballpark that way. And if you don't have the advantage of knowing what the equity rates are or what the union rates are, then you have to find that information out through Glassdoor and looking at people's tax returns for nonprofit and talking to friends and colleagues and being transparent about money. It's constantly trying to figure out what the going rate is an ongoing thing. And social media has helped with that. People who do not have the advantage of understanding what the going rate for a giving job are at a disadvantage because you're going to either wildly overprice yourself and look unrealistic and not get work, or you're going to wildly underprice yourself and not only cost yourself money, but they'll think you're kind of a rube who doesn't know how things work and won't hire you too. The secrecy around salaries is terrible. And most people tend to base what money they're asking for on what they need. And you can't really base your salary ask on what you need. And most employers are basing their offer on what they are willing to pay. And that neither one of those things is actually the major driving force. The going rate for a job is the going rate for a job. I think way too many people base it on their personal situation. Certainly, you should have your own base number. Know what that is. I can't afford to take a job for less than X. And I always encourage young people to figure out what your base. I'm losing money if I don't get at least this. I have to cover my rent and my food and my whatever. And take that money and say, if I need to make X per week, what is that in an hourly figure? What is that in a day rate figure? What is that in a monthly figure? What is that in a yearly salary figure? Because a lot of kids, they're like, hey, we'll pay you $50,000 a year. And they're like, that's great. You're like, what does that break down to for you weekly? What does that break down to you for you hourly? Or how, do the math ahead of time. If they say, we're going to pay you $100 a week, is that good or bad? You got to know, how does your brain think of it? Do you think in terms of hourly? Do you think in terms of daily? Do you think in terms of weekly? I tend to think weekly because that's kind of how the union contracts and stuff I'm used to work. But if somebody offers me a yearly rate, I'm going to break it down in my head immediately to what is that weekly. If somebody offers me a day gig, a 1 day job, I'm going to sort of say, well, how does that work out? Do the math on what it is for you. And you should have your own basic number, but honestly, jobs should be and are rate on what the going rate for that job is, not what you personally need or what they personally feel like they should have to pay.
So would you say the 10% rule is the biggest financial lesson you've learned so far, or are there others?
10% and pay yourself first, which is a hard concept to get across, but just automatically, and if you can do it automatically, there are things where you can get money taken out of your paycheck to go to a 401k or your annuity or whatever it is. If that comes out and you never see it, that's the best way to save because you're not counting on that money because you just never see it. And if you don't have a job that does that for you automatically, do it for yourself. Just automatically take 10%, put it in the savings account, pretend it isn't there. The 10% and the pay yourself first, I think, are key concepts for me.
They're good ones.
Yeah, that and that people who aren't professionals in the business, the stock market is essentially gambling. I buy some single stocks, but for me, it's a fun thing that I do. It's gambling. It's a thing that I have a small cache of money that I play with, and if I make money at it, yay! But for actual investing, I go with no-load mutual funds, with index funds, with things that are based on a metric. I'm not counting on some guy who's taken his cut to guess as well as I do. I think that the stock market is a good place to have your money. I think having your 401k and whatever invested makes sense. But, invest in mutual funds, and don't pay an extra load on a mutual fund for a manager. No load mutual funds, index funds, Vanguard has a lot of them. That's the kind of thing that I think people that aren't investment professionals should be using because otherwise, you may think, hey, I know what the next big thing is, but I can tell you from playing with my little stocks, sometimes you're wrong. And sometimes you're lucky, but that didn't mean I'm smart and I'm lucky.
So do you use specific tools, software, resources to help manage your finances?
I use Quicken, just regular old Quicken. And the nice thing about Quicken is that you can, and I'm sure any finance software can do this, but categorizing what you spend, as you get it, you're tagging it. This is food and drink. This is travel. This is whatever. I categorize them by tax categories. So things that back when we used to be able to deduct things, you could have deductible expenses. You could print off a little report at the end of the year. This is how much came in. This is how much went out. This went to books and records. This went to theater tickets. This went to clothing for work. This went to tools. This went to computers, whatever. Quicken lets you break all that down, write yourself a little report at the end of the year. You've got figures to give to a tax professional or fill out a tax form. Quicken's certainly a tool that I use a lot.
So how did you navigate maintaining financial stability during the slow years we had recently?
I think diversification is key. I think I work as a stage manager. I work as a stagehand. I write books. I do speaking engagements. I teach workshops. I work as an IATSE. I have 10 jobs. Hopefully, between all of them, I worked as a stagehand on the Super Bowl in Tampa in the height of the pandemic, which was not super fun, but it was a well-paying job in the absolute dead of the pandemic. And I could do that because I also work as a stagehand. There was no stage manager work happening at that time. There was no speaking engagements happening at that time. But I could sell some books and work as a stagehand during that time. So a lot of folks are like, oh, I'm not going to have a day job. I'm only going to do this one thing I love. In our business, particularly any freelance, you got to have other irons in the fire. And whether that's I'm waiting tables and working as a stage manager and working weeks at my dad's job and, have a bunch of irons and a bunch of fires. Because I think diversifying is key. And I don't think you have to be or even should be one thing. So many eggs in one basket. That basket is a precarious place.
So how has networking and relationship building impacted your financial and career growth?
In theater, it's everything. It's everything. You get jobs through people. we don't send a lot of cold resumes. And even if we do, whoever's looking at that cold resume is, who do you know that I know? Where have you worked that I know somebody? A cold resume from someone who's never worked with anyone you know, well, it's rare in this business because it's a very small business, but also it's who you know and who you've worked with before, and do I know those folks? And jobs lead to other jobs and people lead to other people. Because again, we don't sit in one job for 20 years. We work this show and that show and this show and that show. So a director you worked with on this show is now doing another show and says, "Oh, hey, I know somebody that can, do this." And networking is also valuable for what I was talking about before, getting the going rate for any kind of job or business. When you've got a network of people that work and know things, you can find out what's the going rate in New York City for a day rate for a corporate stage manager. Things that I may not know from my own experience, but I know people who do that work, and I can kind of find out so I don't embarrass myself with the ask.
That makes sense.
Finances are hard in a freelance life, and that's one of the things I think that they don't impress enough at school. I think that so many kids come out of college thinking they're going to get a full-time job with benefits at a single place and work there like it's the 1950s. And that's not how our business has ever worked, and it's not how a lot of businesses work anymore. You're in charge of your own self. You're your own business. Even if you're working W-2, even if you're not working as an independent contractor, you still are driving your own career, particularly in the performing arts. It's really rare to get a job at a theater and work there for 20 years. That's just like not a thing that happens. And the few staff people that do that, theaters close, people leave, things change, funding goes to hell. Your governor may decide that he's just not going to fund any arts because he got offended by a friend's show. It could happen. Did happen here. So jobs are not as secure as your parents and grandparents think they are, and they're not as secure as I think popular culture has led kids to believe they are. And the realities of freelancing is that you're always, always, always looking for work, and you are your own small business, so you need to learn to run your own small business. Learning the difference between 1099 work and W-2 work, learning about estimated taxes and that kind of stuff. It's the classic 16-year-old goes to work at McDonald's and gets their first check and goes, "Where'd all the money go?" Because money's been taken out for Social Security and taxes. And they're like, "Oh, geez, I thought I was making $10 an hour, and it turns out I'm not making half that." You're like, "Yes, welcome to reality." That's the biggest thing that those teenage jobs, minimum wage jobs, should teach you is, "Oh, hi, yeah." And when you're working freelance, okay, I'm going to get $250 a day. Great. But I have to pay Social Security and taxes out of that. I have to pay for my gas. Do I have to pay for housing? Do I have to pay for lunch? That money starts getting a lot smaller when you do all that math. So you can't think of it as a $250 a day job. You have to think of it as, I'm going to get 50 bucks at the end of the day. And so that changes how you think of your day rate too. When you're paying for your own food and your own rent and your own gas and Social Security and taxes, just take 20% off the top right there. I think kids are not adequately prepared for how much you have to advocate and drive your own life and chart your own career path.
Right. Exactly.
Wow. June, I have been over here just taking notes on all this stuff you've been saying because I forget, we're at like 160 episodes or something of this, and you're just saying all these things that we've covered every once in a while on episodes in the past. And man, I just wish I could say like yes and to all of this. It's amazing. And sometimes Ellen will let me write an article for live design. So there's so much here. I hope that Ellen will let me write up something about this.
Oh, anytime, anytime.
Because it is just so much good stuff. And you're talking about students not being prepared, and that's 100% correct. From having done this podcast now for 4 years, I understand why they're unprepared because there's a lot to it. Like it's not complicated, but like you have to learn by doing. And teachers, even if they're the best intentioned, it's a lot to learn, and everyone's going to go on a different path. But whew, this is amazing.
Maybe we should get Dave Ramsey as a guest.
Well, different people have different systems. Ramsey's got his system, different people have their systems. Theater's such an odd, well, and just the performing arts in general is such an odd thing. It's hard for people that are used to dealing with civilians to really understand how our lives work. And you're like, well, you should just not be a freelancer who does art because that's not remunerative. And you're like, well, yeah, okay.
Although he has some really good points. He goes for the 15% savings rule, which is harder.
Probably more realistic since I learned the 10% when it was a while back.
And he's got a thing about cars. Like when people call in and say, oh, I've got a $30,000 car loan on a $60,000 truck, he's like, sell it tomorrow. And they're like, I can't. It's my prime vehicle. And he's like, why do you need a $60,000 truck if you can't afford it? Get rid of it. Buy a $20,000 truck with what's left over and pay yourself every month. Don't pay whoever you're paying that money to. And he keeps going, your car loan is going to keep you broke. Your car loan is going to keep you broke. I can't tell you how many times he has said that.
I will say, though, one thing I run into a lot is that the generation older than me tends to really have, if kids have an unrealistic idea of what work is like, old people have an unrealistic idea of how much things cost. A $60,000 car when I was first driving was top of the line Mercedes amazing car. And now that's kind of a Camry. Things cost more, a lot more.
Yeah, I agree with you. But his theory is if you can't afford it, don't buy it. My daughter was looking for a car, and I told her, don't get a car loan. Go on the Dave Ramsey plan. If you can afford a $7,000 car, buy a $7,000 car. It'll get you to work. And every month, put the $700 that you would have been paying on a car loan on the $30,000 car in the bank. At the end of 2 years, you'll have $14,000 saved up. Sell the $7,000 car for $5,000, then you've got $20,000 for a better car. But you can afford it.
I get the theory of that, but I spent most of my life with kind of dodgy used cars that I paid $5,000 for, $10,000 for. They break down a lot all the time, and you end up with weird, unexpected repair expenses, and suddenly you don't have reliable transportation. And the day I bought a car that I was not going to regularly have to, oh, please start, please start. Please don't have weird lights.
Well, I think there's a happy medium. I'm not saying to go buy a clunker, but
yeah, you need a good enough car that it's reliable, that it will get you where you need to go. That if you work in Florida, I work all around the state sometimes, and people are like, well, it's still in Florida. When I applied to work, well, I worked at a cruise ship in Hawaii, but before I left, I was in Florida. I had to go get a Coast Guard physical and a Coast Guard I had to do Coast Guard paperwork because I basically had to join the Coast Guard. I live in Tampa, and they said, well, you have to go to Jacksonville to do all of your intake and paperwork, and you have to go to Miami to get your physical done. And I'm like, why can't I do all of it in one place? And they said, oh, no, this is how the stations are set up. And I said, but I can't do any of it in Tampa, even though we have a massive Coast Guard presence. No. Okay. And I said, but those are so far apart. And they said, well, they're all in the state of Florida. Sometimes we actually have to have people drive across state lines to get. And I said, do you know how big Florida is? Jacksonville's 5 hours one way, Miami's the 5 hours the other way, and there's 10 hours between them. It is a long state. I get it, but if you have to drive from one end of Florida to the other, from one end of Texas to the other, that's crazy. But we do. I work in Orlando, I work in Miami, I work in Jacksonville. And so I know how long those drives are because I've done them. I've done them for work. But I need a car that can drive 5 hours.
His point is people call up and they say, I've got $200,000 in student debt. I've got $135,000 in credit card debt and a $30,000 car loan. And he's like, sell the car, get out of the debt, then buy yourself a car when you can afford it. Anyway, it's an aside, but.
Well, okay, I want to jump in though with my 2 cents. I think what Dave Ramsey does really well is he says, be realistic. It's sort of like figure it out and like, don't kid yourself. And I will say, to pitch my own podcast, but episode 84 is called Dave Ramsey Financial Advice.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah, and we go through all the steps, and you can decide for yourself because, like June was saying, his stuff is not tailored for freelancers. Like if a freelancer, if I were to call him the Dave Ramsey show, he would say, Ethan, get realistic, switch careers.
Get a job, yeah. Well, that's why there are accountants in New York who handle all the Broadway people, because a regular accountant would take a look at somebody with a stack of 1099s this big and go, get out of my office,
I use one of those. I've tried local accountants. They don't understand when you've got 8 W-2s and 3 1099s from one year. much less 10 different states, 15 different states, and things that are deductible. An accountant will tell you clothing's not deductible. Well, it is if you buy an unusual amount of black clothing for your job. But that takes an accountant who understands that sort of thing. Those do not exist in the wild because why would they ever bone up on those specialties? Because there's so few of us, But you can get really bad financial advice from normal civilian accountants. Their frame of reference is normal civilian work. The New York accountants will tell you, for instance, if you get per diem for a job, you cannot deduct that per diem if you do not have a fixed place of residence. So if I'm on tour and I just give up my New York apartment and I literally have no home address, that per diem is taxable as income because per diem pays for you to be away from your home if you don't have a home. So the bottom line for touring people, for instance, is that you must maintain a home address. And most of us try to maintain a home address in a state that has no income tax, state income tax, like Florida or Washington, or, if you don't maintain a home address, your per diem may be taxable. Well, that's a shocking thing to find out, and you don't want to find it out the hard way. And I learned that from my accountant who, she was like, "Oh yeah, don't move out and just have a PO box, my friend. Keep a residence, whether it's and if you have a room in your parents' house or a room in your brother's house, pay them rent. Whether it's nominal rent or not, have a mailing address and pay them rent so that you've got a paper trail of bills that demonstrate that you have a residence, because you don't want the IRS deciding that a huge chunk of your per diem is actually taxable income." You have to be wary of investment professionals and tax professionals and money gurus like Dave Ramsey or whoever, who are not at all familiar with our business because it is a specialized thing. And sometimes we pay for specialized accountants or specialized financial advisors because, at least someone who understands freelancing, at least someone who understands travel. I used to like Suzy Orman in the day, and one of the things I liked about her was explaining the concept of high interest credit cards, low interest credit cards. If you have $100,000 in credit card debt and you have 5 credit cards, you pay the minimum on all of them, but if you have a little more than the minimum available to you, instead of spreading it evenly across those 5 cards, you would pick your highest interest card, pay as much as you could toward that, and the minimum on the other 4 until you paid that one off. And then you would take that money and put it on the next highest interest card and work your way down, calling the credit card companies and seeing if you can get the interest reduced. The fact that credit cards are they're a whole thing. One, the interest rates are crazy. Two, if you're late for a payment one time, they can jack your interest rate. They can double your interest rate. You can end up paying 20, 25% interest rate on a credit card because you missed a payment the one time. Not even missed it, but we're late.
Right. Not that I'm in love with him, but Dave Ramsey will tell you, get those cards and cut them up, throw them away.
But that's not realistic.
He says, if you can't afford it, don't buy it. And what's interesting is that I've lived basically in a French place since 1984. And the French do not have credit cards. They have debit cards. And you can work it out with your bank to have like a 5 to 10 day. If you have a lot of money or a reasonable amount of money, you can work it out with your bank to have a 5 to 10 day grace period. So like if they are supposed to take it out on the 30th of every month, but you've made a deal with them, they'll take it out on the 10th of the next month, which means they're really lending you the money. They don't take it out on a day-to-day thing, but they take it out in a lump at the end of the month. Other people have a debit card where it does come out every day, depending on your relationship with the bank. But when I tell people in France that Americans have an average of $10,000 to $20,000 in credit card debt, and the national credit card debt is $1.4 trillion, they look at me like they can't imagine. They all live that way. Everyone in France, poor, middle class, rich, they all live that way. They have no idea.
Sounds like my dad. The thing is, it's realities exist, right? One, if you're touring, you have to have a credit card. You're paying for hotels, you're paying for meals.
Debit card.
If you use a debit card at a hotel, they will charge the amount of your stay on your debit card until the end of the stay, and then they release back what they didn't take. It's a huge whack at one time. Some hotels require you to have a credit card. Some rental car companies require you to have a credit card. It is almost impossible to get through life without a credit card. Also, if you're a normal young freelancer, you're going to have an unexpected car expense, an unexpected medical expense. You need the credit card for safety's sake. But what you can do is be careful of interest rates. I don't have a lot of consumer credit cards. I don't have a Sears card, store cards, gas cards, individual company cards. I don't have a lot of that stuff. But also, how does your credit rating work, right? I know a number of people that would get a tour job or get a big job, make a lot of money, pay off their cards and do the Ramsey thing and close them all. And their credit rating went to hell because your credit rating is based on what's available to you as much as it is what you owe. And if you suddenly close all your cards, you're taking away the amount of money that is available to you. You can severely hurt your credit rating by suddenly closing a bunch of credit cards.
Well, he thinks the credit rating is a bunch of hokum,
It is, but world is based on it. The world is based on it.
Right. Well, I think I probably have 0 credit rating because I've never had any debt.
It's a debt to income ratio. You don't want to have a lot of debt. That's bad for your credit rating, but you need to have money available to credit rating is its own separate podcast. And I'm sure you're nodding. But the fact is, you could be doing things that you think are good for you financially that are hurting your credit rating. And your credit rating affects people look at your credit rating and decide if they're going to hire you or not.
Well, that's ridiculous.
But they do it. I mean, there's reality and, much less buying a car, buying a house, taking out a loan, any of those things. Credit ratings get used not just, believe me, the rental car companies will look up your credit rating. Certainly, it affects the interest rate that you get on the credit cards that you do have in need, right? So having a terrible credit rating means that you're only going to be offered really high interest cards, whereas if you have a decent credit rating, one, you look for lower interest cards, and two, you can call the company and say, is there any way I can get this rate down? And three, paying off those higher interest cards first and trying not to use them less. And if you're going to close cards, get rid of the ones with the higher interest rate and work your way down. Get rid of the loans with a higher interest rate and work your way down. I would rather pay off a high interest credit card than pay off my mortgage early. And I would rather pay off my car. So again, consumer loans versus home loans versus student loans, there's different qualities of, for me, the very basic thing for a credit card was to have the minimum payment automatically taken out of my bank account every month. So I'm never late or missing a payment. It doesn't pay the whole balance. I'd like to pay the whole balance. Sometimes I do pay the whole balance. But if I get busy and life happens, I'm not going to accidentally be a couple days late on a credit card payment, because just a couple days late on one credit card payment can literally double my interest rate for 6 months or a year, or until I call them and ask them to take it back down. And again, you read the fine print, it's horrifying. They have the right to jack your interest rate for the tiniest of reasons and leave it that way for sometimes 3 months or 6 months, sometimes a year, sometimes forever. So it's a booby trap. And credit cards are booby traps in general, but you got to know what you're getting into. There's people that are against having payments taken out of your account regularly because you don't want to accidentally overdraw. But accidentally being late on a payment is also very, very fiscally dangerous. So balance those things.
All right. This episode's getting a little long for me.
That's all right. We'll have June back. This is fascinating.
No, June, I have to have you back because we have done 3 credit cards. That is one of my least favorite topics. We've done 3 episodes on it, and I still have yet to do a constructive episode on it. And I feel like I need you back and we could do a constructive episode on it.
I think all credit cards bad is so limiting.
And I will say that we've actually had a couple people on the show that have lived without them, because I didn't think that was a possibility. But it turns out there are some people. But I will say those people, it's been like 3 or 4, they have access to people that have them when they need them. You know what I mean? Like whether it's a spouse or a family member.
It's interesting you say that, because we went to Guadeloupe one time, another island down here, and we had made the car rental reservation in my husband's name. And he's got this debit card that has €1,000 a day limit. And this credit card wanted a €1,500 deposit to take the car. And he had absolutely no way to do it. They wouldn't take cash, they wouldn't take a check, and they wouldn't take his debit card, which I was floored, because they're in Guadeloupe. Who did they think was coming there to rent these cars? So, of course, I used my car. But if he had been with his brothers or his sisters or other people from here, they would have been in trouble. So I do agree with June that unfortunately there are instances where you really do need that card.
And also, I want to say, June, that I learned about the per diem and a home address. I never knew that. So it's like every episode, I learned something new. That's incredible.
Touring has its own particular financial quirks, and that's one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people who do the cruise ship route don't have a permanent address. They go from ship to ship.
But they put themselves in a possible tax liability position by doing that.
Amazing. I want to ask an LDI question. June, you're talking at LDI. What are you talking about, and what do you want people to take away from that?
I'm participating in a couple of panels. I'm not leading one this year, and talking about spotlights and what's the best spotlight to use for your space, and the differences in LED spotlights and more conventional spotlights, and things like we were talking about early on with what's the difference between a black track system where the spotlight is automatically following a receiver on a person's costume versus a remote control system where you're in the basement driving a thing in the rig versus a moving light that someone's steering around versus a conventional spotlight that you're controlling all the things. The differences between that is hazy, and I'm hoping to clarify that for some folks.
That's awesome. That's awesome. On a personal level, are you going to have any extra time at LDI? What are you looking forward to doing?
This year, I'm only doing a hit and run. I'm popping in and out pretty quick because I sub on the Lion King tour, and of course, inevitably, when they need me to come cover isn't exactly when a conference is happening, when something else is happening. So I have to sort of, it's going to be a quickie in and out this year.
I did a hit and run last year for LDI, and it was horrible. I was like, I can never do this again because it's like you miss so much good stuff.
I will say, Vegas is so hard right now, and once they built the tracks for the car and they put walls up everywhere, it's hard to do things quickly because you can't just run in and run out. You have to plan your attack. I miss the days when it went to Orlando every other year. I do.
Yeah, unfortunately, Vegas is a much more successful city for us. The exhibitors are much happier.
Well, I don't know. Some of the East Coast exhibitors are, geez, I wish because there are a lot of theater, particularly. There's a lot of New York-based and East Coast-based folks that.
Well, we do talk about it. It's not totally out of the realm of possibility.
And again, I often partner with Lyceum Spotlights, and they let me share their booth and push my stuff, and I show off their spotlights. But they're in New York, so they've got to ship spotlights to Las Vegas. It's a business expense part of the thing, but also just time zone wise, a lot of the New York based and East Coast based, Canto's based in the East Coast, Lyceum's based in the East Coast. I just know from the spot manufacturers I know. Orlando's got the competing attractions but I think sometimes it's easier to convince your family to go to Orlando for the weekend.
Yeah. I love the title of your book with the 101 spotlight excuses. It makes me think of Doug Fleener's DMX-controlled electric dog collar for sleeping follow spot operators.
Very much. Well, I spent a whole summer in Philadelphia one year, and oh my God, those guys are hilarious. But they were, because they would come up with crazy, not the usual just, oh my guy moved stuff, but they were like, I was eating pistachios, and then I just started writing down the crazy stuff they said.
What theater were you at? That's my hometown, Philadelphia.
The Academy of Music.
Oh, what a great space.
Yeah. Although the Academy of Music, I was there with, it was not built for follow spots, and it was not built for the big shows that we have now. It's shaped like a cello. The whole building is. There's one little projection booth out front where you can put a follow spot that's shooting through a little window, but they literally had to build positions in where there used to be doors. So there's literally like a pipe and drape box in the hallway with the spotlight shooting through where a door used to be to get spot positions at all, which is one of the reasons that we had so much going on. I was in the booth. The guys were in their little pods. I can't see them during the show. The only conversation I have is over headset. So they were doing all sorts of stuff. Like, spot 3, where are you? I was in the bathroom, but it's fine. There was a line. You're like, what? Could you really? And so I just started writing down their stuff, and there was so much excuses and stuff that I said, listen, you guys, if we get to 101, I'm going to be able to write a big little book, which again dates me. But the big little book of this or that. And so that was at the end of that run. I put together the big little book of spotlight excuses. And I was like, I got to get to 101 by the end of the summer. Help me out.
Love it. Love it.
All right, June, this was awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure. I'm glad that someone's dealing with artistic finance because, boy, most young people aren't taught anything about finances, but certainly no one in the theater's taught about finances. Because so many of us are self-employed, it's mad important.
And that what you were saying about Dave Ramsey and advice not going to freelancers, that I feel like is what we're hitting at here. It's like all these episodes that are really specific. Although I haven't done one on touring because I never didn't cross my mind, but
Talk to me. Well, because there are specific considerations with touring. Even people that aren't freelancing in theater are freelancing in the theater because even if you're working as a W-2 employee through the union or working at a theater, how do you know you're not being crazy unemployed at your nonprofit theater? How do you know that you're not being crazy underpaid? It's so easy to underpay people who like what they do for a living. It is so easy to underpay artists because we're constantly told that they should be thrilled to be able to get to do what they're doing at all. And so you're like, you get to do what you love and you can basically survive. So what are you whining about? And you're like, well, because anybody doing a comparable job in another industry would be getting paid 3 times what I am. I don't think you should have to hate your job to make a decent living. But it's so easy to take advantage of people who love their jobs.
yeah, and I want to jump in and respond because you were saying the fact that you're in Actors Equity and you're in IATSE, you can see rates. And also you mentioned networking is important because the people you know, you can ask them, hey, what should the rate be? Which I just did recently because I've never worked at a theme park and I'm now doing a design there. And so I texted 4 different people who I knew worked at theme parks and I said, hey, what's the rate? And they all roughly came back with, a good ballpark. And I was like, okay, so that's what.
Yeah. And for a lot of nonprofit companies, you can look it up, what they're sort of.
But well, that and Glassdoor, but those that's a little bit of legwork, and also it's sometimes it's hard to find.
Our industry.
So I actually want to say that's another thing with this show is that if anybody listening wants to know the market rate of something, just email me, artisticfinancepodcast@gmail.com, because I will just email people out. Like if you don't know people that know, I will just email everybody I know in that job type, and I will ask, and I will get back to you.
That's a great thing. That's a great thing because again, having you available as a resource, having any resource, because the kids are like, how am I possibly supposed to know what the going rate is? If you don't have contacts, if you don't have, union information, where to even start? That's a really important and hard thing to know.
If you have a question, you turn to your right, you ask somebody. And if not, you turn to your left, you ask somebody. And then if that doesn't work, then you email me.
Right.
It's another reason to peruse job listings, even if you're not particularly looking, just so you get an idea of what's being offered. And again, what's being offered isn't necessarily the going rate because, as I said, they tend to offer what they'd like to pay. Well, okay. I mean, I wish I could bid jobs out for what I'd like to pay too. I'd like to pay $100 to have someone paint my house, but they're not going to do that.
Amazing. Well, this is awesome. Thank you so much.
Fabulous. Thank you. It was really interesting. Really interesting. See you in Las Vegas.
Absolutely.
That's it for this week's episode. My takeaways are, well, first, I want to give a shout out to Max Marquez. Now, I haven't talked to Max since 2017 when we were in San Francisco working on the musical Roman Holiday, but I was tracking the follow spots there, and Max was the spotlight supervisor. So while we were teching, we would get through a section and then we would run it. And after we ran it, Max, of his own accord, would just take over calling the spots. Now, this is amazing because usually the follow spot tracker is the one doing that until we get into dress rehearsals, and then the spotlight supervisor takes over. But Max took over as soon as he sort of learned the section. Anyway, that was amazing for me. And if anybody knows Max, let him know that he's the best follow spot operator and supervisor that I've ever worked with. All right, but that's just a side tangent. So Money Magazine. Now, it's been a while since we've mentioned that on the show, but that's the magazine that I subscribed to in college, and it helped me understand things like compound interest. It seemed like every single edition had a compound interest chart with an article that said, save $5 a day and you'll be a millionaire by the time you retire, or something like that. And I remember after reading it so many times, I was like, okay, I gotta do it, because I would read the article and it made sense. It was like, oh, wow, you really can do that. So anyway, The Wealthy Barber, that's a great book to instill financial understanding. It's great, I think, to pick a book or an author or find some financial philosophy in your life and stick with it, because they all have the same message, roughly, which is pay yourself and invest. Other similar books are The Automatic Millionaire and The Millionaire Next Door. And I remember for me, Rich Dad, Poor Dad was where I learned about assets versus liabilities and to invest, then invest some more and just keep on going. Side note, we have a bookshop.org link in the show notes for all these books. So if you do want to pick up any of them, please purchase them through our links. And the reason we use bookshop.org is that it supports local bookstores, and it's really good about making sure they get their market share and that we as an affiliate will get 10% of things that are purchased through our links. Now, if you want June's books, only one of them is available through bookshop.org. That's the Spotlight Operator's Handbook. If you want the 101 Follow Spot Excuses, you can get that through June's website, which facilitates through Amazon. And those links are in the show notes or at artisticfinance.com/166bonus. June's lifelong philosophies that she got from the Wealthy Barber: save 10% of everything and pay yourself first. Those are tried and true. It really just boils down to doing it consistently for your whole life. And if you're doing that, and if you start early enough, you're good to go. You don't need to worry about what's life going to look like because you know that you've done what you've needed to do. Save 10% of everything and make sure you're paying yourself first before you even pay your bills. Don't listen to me if bill collectors are calling. Saving for retirement is not a luxury. It's a necessity. That taps into the entire reason that we have this show. People working in entertainment and the arts have a necessity to save for retirement. Because the income structure is set up outside of traditional workplace retirement and healthcare structures means that artsy people must set up their own retirement and healthcare on their own. It's not okay to not save for retirement, which is why I'm always harping on Roth IRAs, because they're the simplest thing anyone can set up in less than 5 minutes. And I just love June's calm statement: saving for retirement is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Actors Equity Association and IATSE providing baseline income expectations. Now, having access to this information is a leg up on pricing your going rate. Now, social media can help, but otherwise you have to go to a site like Glassdoor or a nonprofit tax filing to sort of find rates and what budgets are and things like that. The same goes for USA 829. It sets minimum fee structures for designers. If anybody's listening and wants to help me with an episode going through some of these IATSE, Actor Equity, and USA rates, I would love it. Basically, it'd be cool if we could grab somebody from each of the unions, grab the collectively bargained agreements, and sort of sift through them just to see what salaries and fees are. None of it's magic, none of it's surprising, but if you don't know, you don't know. Don't base a salary ask on what you need, and know that producers price on what money they have. But as June said, neither are correct. You need to charge the going rate of what that specific job is, and this is helpful to keep in mind because it goes back to when you have to negotiate your fee. Don't negotiate from your personal life, negotiate with the market factors that impact the price. Things like the hours required, the skill required, the location, etc. It's not you negotiating, it's this imaginary market person negotiating. What would they charge? Also, do the math ahead of time for what you need financially to survive. That way, when you are negotiating your rate, you know what number you can't dip below. Now, this ties into budgeting. Now, Nicole and I haven't done a budget for several years, and we need to since our lives have changed a lot with a kid, moving, purchasing a car, and most recently purchasing a home. Now that we're all settled, we sort of need to add up the bills and find out what our basic living number is. Automate, the best way to save. Again, this is something I haven't harped on for a while, but the tried and true brilliance of the modern age. We can complain about capitalism and technology ruining our lives, but automated savings and retirement investing is the thing that can save us from ourselves. So automate, automate, automate. And I'm saying this to myself because when COVID happened, I stopped automating a lot of our things, including my retirement savings. And I mentioned the Automatic Millionaire. Well, the reason that's a great book is because it talks about how you can set yourself up for success through automating payments. including the math of how you can pay off a house or a car sooner without actually paying any more, but merely setting up the automatic payments sooner in the month or the year. Now, it's been years since I've read that book, but it's so good. I highly recommend it if you can pick it up for some background reading. The stock market is gambling. Yes, it is gambling. Only use fund money in the stock market. For actual investing, do index funds or no-load mutual funds. Now, the irony in this is that index funds and mutual funds track the market, and that means that they are stocks too. But this is a very good clarification about individual stocks versus about the market overall. Individual stocks fluctuate wildly, and companies can go bankrupt. So even companies that have been around for 100 years, or they seem like they're unstoppable, like General Electric a decade ago, or recently Boeing, which isn't going bankrupt, but is falling on rough times. June said that sometimes I'm lucky, but I'm not an expert, which is so very true. Because if you pick, say, NVIDIA, chances are that it's going to do pretty well with all the AI investment going on. And in that case, you would be lucky. But there's also a chance that AI investment fades or it changes in the next few years and it goes down before you can sell it. Now, if instead you purchase an index, it will trend up or down slowly. And so, yes, your upside doesn't grow quickly, but you have plenty of time to sell if the trend goes down. And if you don't sell, the rate of decline is much slower than the quick big drops of an individual company. Now, side note, we never sell except for personal reasons if we need the money in our real life, but it has nothing to do with where the market is at any given time. If you haven't listened to any of our Artistic Finance 6K episodes, this is exactly the thing we're learning there every time. None of us can pick stocks that beat the market. The finance people do it better, but they're also doing it safer and through indexes. Now, this taps into something from last episode with Asia, whose grandpa said saving $10,000 that you can live without, then invest. So now we're saying investing versus buying some stocks. So this $10,000, I wouldn't call fund money if it's for investing. But for my 2 cents, and what Nicole and I actually do is with our investment money, we put it into the S&P 500 index. So that's it, nothing else. There's no playing around. It's just out of the savings into the brokerage account and automatically into the S&P 500. Now, fund money would be the Artistic Finance 6K episodes where we pick stocks in an attempt to see if we could be just as good as the market. And you can go listen to find out if we succeeded at that. Quicken categorizes transactions into the appropriate tax deduction area. I have a Chase credit card and it also sorts things, or you can go in and pick the category to what belongs. So there's easy ways to do that. Diversification, theater and concerts and events, stagehand and stage management, books and stagehand work are what got June through the pandemic because there was no SM work. She said you got to have other irons in the fire and you shouldn't be just one thing or have all your eggs in one basket, which ties back to audio engineer Jordan Gilliam, who is saying, don't let tunnel vision of a career pigeonhole you into one thing. And we're not saying you have to learn things in various career paths, but within live events, there's a lot to do. So don't stay in your lane if something else is interesting. In theater, networking is everything. You get jobs through people. And even if you do send a resume, it's only viewed as what name on this resume do I know? It's a small business, which is why it works that way. And so if you're a young person listening to the show, yes, you do need a resume, but that's just for someone to glance at and know that you're a real person. But people need specific things and they merely ask who's around them, which means it's all about relationships with your colleagues. But June mentioned that networking is also important about finding the going rate. You're able to ask, what is the day rate in New York City for a stage manager? You're able to ask the other people that you're working with, what should we be charging? What should I be expecting? It's not just about getting the next job. You are your own small business, so understanding overhead is important. You can't think of it as $250 for the day. You have to think of it as I'm going to end up with $50 after all the taxes and fees. This is a brilliant and simple way to think about it. So as a rule of thumb, just know that whatever you get in pay, only 20% of it is going to be going into your life and your savings. The rest is going to be going to taxes, health insurance, equipment, things like that. Ellen mentioned Dave Ramsey says to save 15%. Now that's the modern advice. Back pre-2000, let's say, 10% was the way that financial advisors said to do it, save 10% of everything. Now the trend seems to be saving 15%. So let's modify June's Wealthy Barber philosophy to pay yourself first and save 15% of every paycheck. Also, another reference to our last episode with Asia Jackson. She said, listen to advice that's meant for you. Now, that's something you have to decide for yourself. But June pointed out that when Dave Ramsey says pay cash for everything, that's not bad advice. And cut up credit cards, also not bad financial advice, but it might not apply to you. So if you do take that advice, you can make it work for you. Just doing things by maybe getting a credit card just for work and travel when it's a necessity, but otherwise paying cash for everything. And speaking of credit cards, a few people on the show haven't had them. Back on episode 2, actor Chuck Cooper, he didn't use credit cards for a long time. And episode 106, Jamie Esteva Wilson, he still doesn't use credit cards. Suzy Orman, I need to do an episode covering Suzy Orman's financial advice. It's not so different from Dave Ramsey's, and it's a definite push for paying off debt. And yes, debt is the American way, but you need a store of wealth to allow you to use that debt to your advantage. It's weird, I know, but the first part is paying off high interest debt. So if you want to listen to our episode on Dave Ramsey, that was episode 84. artisticfinance.com/84. And I will say I did get some messages after that episode because a freelance lifestyle is not symbiotic with that advice. Learning about per diem and a home address, that was news to me. A post office box doesn't count. So find somebody you can trust and ask them to be your place of residence. And one last thing, June and Ellen discussed LDI in Orlando and Vegas. So for a long time, LDI would rotate each year between Orlando and Vegas. Now, it hasn't been that way for 10 years or so, but clearly some people wouldn't mind it being in Orlando. Okay, that's it for my takeaways. If you're getting value from this show and you want to support its future, become a Patreon patron. That's a great way to help. We've now surpassed 1,000 downloads a month, which means that you might hear ads when you listen to the show. And just know that all patrons get a podcast feed, which is ad-free and includes early releases of episodes. If you're so inclined, sign up at patreon.com/artisticfinance. The dad joke to end the episode, and this might be a little morbid, but hey, they can't all be winners. How is saving for retirement like running a fallow spot? It's all about consistent operation and hitting your targets so that you can shine bright up until the final blackout. That's it for today. Until next week, break a leg.
Thank you for listening to Artistic Finance, where we interview successful artists, leaders, and investors to help educate and inspire the creative community. To access our show notes and resources, go to artisticfinance.com. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Before making any decision, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Artistic Finance. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.